Everyone, and thank you for joining today's webinar. I'm Stacy Gladding with EPA's Energy Star's commercial buildings team. On today's webinar, you'll be hearing from Mike Barkin from Emerson. Emerson is one of our industrial partners, and they've won a Partner of the Year award 2 times now. And last spring at our Partner of the Year award winner ceremony, Mike's colleagues spoke about Emerson's decarbonization success story, and that message resonated well with the audience, so we decided to invite them back this time for this webinar so their experience could be shared with a broader audience to both our industrial and commercial building stakeholders. So we hope you will be able to take some best practices and apply them in your own buildings and plants. So now I'll introduce Mike. He is Emerson's Sustainable Energy Manager, leading the company's centralized Scope 1 and 2 reduction program in pursuit of achieving net zero operations by 2030. Over the past 2 years with the team, he has conducted Energy Star energy treasure hunts across 3 continents while leading Emerson's energy management program, and he has driven global renewable energy procurement initiatives and also implemented Emerson's internal carbon price program. So thank you, Mike, for being here, and I'll turn it over to you to get started.
Thanks, Stacy. Appreciate the introduction and very excited to be here with you all today to share Emerson's net zero strategy. I'll focus a lot more on our Scope 1 and 2 decarbonization strategy as opposed to Scope 3, as that's what I'm a little bit more of an expert on, but nonetheless, we'll touch on all of the areas included in this strategy. To start here today, I'll just talk a little bit about the company. Emerson, you may be familiar with us, but over the past couple of years, we've really reinvented ourselves as a pure play industrial automation company. So gone are the days where we had the Copeland entity and manufactured compressors. Now we are all in the business of software and control, along with our intelligent devices. And you can see a couple of our notable brands in the top left corner there. We're pretty geographically diverse as well as end market diverse, a little bit more concentrated over here in the Americas, but nonetheless notable presence across Asia and Europe as well. A little bit more focused on the classical energy markets, as well as some of the chemical and industrial, but increasingly driving sales in a number of the new developing markets as well. We're based in St. Louis and a little over 70,000 employees worldwide. It says 130 manufacturing locations according to the SEC, but we do track about 200 of our energy consuming locations and have another 400 or so on top of that. Energy Star has been very impactful in terms of how we perceive ourselves and how we go externally as well with our environmental sustainability progress. And we have been awarded with the Energy Star Partner of the Year for the past 2 years. So we're very thankful for the support from Energy Star. We've also driven significant progress with our CDP and EcoVadis ratings. We're very proud to share that we actually just received another silver medal for 2024 as well. Talk a little bit about our framework for environmental sustainability. We call this our greening of, greening by, and greening with strategy. And I think the best way to understand it is to look at the little icons on top of the text there. So greening of includes everything that goes on within Emerson's 4 walls. So that's a lot of the Scope 1 and 2 pieces, and of course, some of the Scope 3 pieces as well. Greening by is how we go out and interact with our customers to use our technologies and solutions to drive decarbonization at our customer sites and support them on their sustainability journeys as well. And then greening with is really how we foster this collaboration across our value chain with partners such as governments, non-government organizations, industry trade groups, and with our supply chain as well. I will talk a little bit more about our greening of strategy, but I do want to note that I think it's very important that everyone in your company can see themselves, or organization can see themselves within your sustainability framework. So our greening by, that really touches on all of our sales channels and our engineering development as well. And then of course, a number of functions are going to touch on that greening with area. So we really want to make sure that that message resonates clearly across the organization, because that's the only way you can drive 70,000 plus people towards the same vision. To talk broadly about our net zero targets, our overall target for Scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions is net zero by 2045 from our 2021 baseline. But in my role, I focus especially on this interim target on the right side, which is our 2030 short-term targets. And our goal there is to drive to net zero operations across scope 1 and 2 emissions by 2030. And within that, we will certainly drive a absolute reduction of scope 3 emissions by 25%. And we're also aiming to source 100% renewable electricity across our facilities. And importantly, I think for this Energy Star audience, is reduce our energy intensity by 35% from our 2021 baseline. And that is an increase in our previous target, which was 25% from 2018. And as you'll shortly see, we exceeded that. So whenever we achieve our target, we have to set a more ambitious one as well. So this slide, and I'll start by really highlighting what we've been doing in terms of the scope 1 and 2 before I sort of end this talk with our scope 3 progress as well. Since starting, we've driven an emission intensity reduction of over 52% and a very significant absolute reduction in our emissions as well. And a big part of that comes from our energy intensity reduction. So throughout the first couple of years of our program, we relied very heavily on Energy Star's energy treasure hunt process and have really scaled that up worldwide across our many facilities. In 2023 alone, we completed 30 events. And actually, the majority of these are now being driven by our local teams instead of from our corporate entity. And we've saved millions of dollars by driving this progress and actually addressed well over 50% of our energy footprint and about 60% of our emission footprint as well. In the same time, some of the big emission reductions we've seen have come from increasing our renewable electricity coverage from about 5% in 2021 to almost 50% in 2023. And I think this roadmap really captures a lot of the ways that we've driven that improvement, especially starting from those early days. So on the Y, the vertical axis, that is the total emissions, and then of course years on the horizontal axis. And the total length of the bar represents what our emissions would have been had we not driven this decarbonization strategy. So as the years go on, we would hope that our sales continue to grow, which means we need to produce more, which means we're using more energy as we go and therefore more emissions. And each of the 4 colored bars represent our 4 main levers to reduce our scope 1 and 2 emissions. And these may be called different things by different entities, but the reality is many of us are driving the same strategies. These are the main tools in most of our toolboxes. And they're in the order that they are because this is in increasing order of cost. So we always want to start with the most cost-effective ways when we're driving decarbonization. And that's, of course, why we always start with energy efficiency. It doesn't cost anything to turn the lights off. And we always know that the easiest kilowatt hour to save is the one that you don't use in the first place. Our second strategy, and perhaps our most impactful long-term, is our switch to low carbon electricity. And that's through the use of renewable electricity contracting, on-site solar, and other mechanisms to drive down those emission factors for our electricity consumption. There's a very big jump in cost between our second and third pillar, our third pillar being the scope 1 abatement, primarily through electrification and alternative fuel sources. So very big cost jump and really reinforces why we want to be driving those first 2 pillars as well. And then an even larger cost jump happens from the third to the fourth strategy, which is carbon neutralization or carbon offsetting. Emerson, as a technology company and as a company that supports the carbon capture industry, we want to make sure we're doing this through high quality carbon removal. We want to be capturing that carbon and permanently sequestering it in the ground. And that's the way that our Chief Sustainability Officer has been very passionate about how we should go about these carbon offsets. So we don't have too much in the way of purchasing, or we don't have too much in the way of experience at this point, but it's certainly in our roadmap and something that we continue to explore. In terms of the Energy Treasure Hunt program, as I mentioned, we've got about 200 manufacturing sites and another couple hundred facilities around the world. And I already spend quite a bit of my time traveling to our various sites. And unfortunately, I just don't have the time to get to all 200 of those sites. So the strategy we implemented very early on, which we learned from Energy Star, of course, was this train the trainers approach, where we identified key energy stakeholders in various world areas and various businesses around the world. We educated them on the energy treasure hunt process. We did treasure hunts at their facilities, and ultimately they were able to go and across other world areas, across other parts of their business, drive additional progress. So for example, you see in the top left, we did a very early treasure hunt in January 2020, and that energy leader went on to drive another 3 completely independently. Of course, we do provide oversight and support for the teams that need it, but at this point, more of our treasure hunts are being facilitated by those regional leaders as opposed to our enterprise sustainability team. And as I mentioned, we've seen well over $4 million in annual low-cost savings opportunities, and that has been extremely impactful at driving our strategy. Recently, too, we built a pretty comprehensive SharePoint site that tailors the Energy Star guidance to be a little bit more specific to Emerson's needs and really more applicable to the different facility types that we have, so we can be more bespoke about guiding our key stakeholders to find those energy reduction opportunities. While we do rely very heavily on these low cost and no cost energy reduction opportunities, we also do rely, of course, on the capital investments as well. And these are some of the common opportunities that I'm sure many of you have implemented across your facility networks that have very strong payback periods and tend to make a little bit easier when you're having conversations with the finance teams and going out and asking for money. So particularly impactful has been the implementation of automated building control systems or building management systems. It helps when you do make some of the products that can fit this need, but we're pretty product agnostic. We'll use anyone's product to help us get the job done. So a couple examples across Europe where we were successfully able to drive that implementation. And we tend to see about 10% holistic energy improvement when we install these systems, although of course it's a little bit dependent on the facility personnel being able to drive some of those improvements as well. In terms of our air compressors, we use a lot of compressed air across our operations, although we constantly try to reduce that wherever possible due to the inefficiencies of using compressed air. But wherever we do have unavoidable compressed air use, we certainly try to capture that waste heat from our compressors, either through heat exchangers or directly pumping it back into our factories to support and reduce our heating loads during cold winters. The next one is the air curtains for our high-use garage doors, where we have forklifts coming in and out of our buildings. And these provide a very thin film of air that is very effective at limiting heat transfer from in and out of the plant, which protects all of that nicely conditioned air and keeps our employees much more comfortable. So the feedback on these opportunities has been very positive overall. And then finally, probably preaching to the choir here, but variable speed drives for pumps and motors, really anything over 5 or 10 kilowatts is well suited in many cases for these variable speed applications. And we've certainly tried to drive that across our process systems as well as our comfort heating and cooling systems. In terms of renewable electricity, we have significantly increased our renewable electricity usage over the past few years, as I said, from about 5% in 2021 to nearly 50% in 2023. And a lot of that improvement has been across North America and Latin America. Europe, we had a number of sites that historically had always gone out and been passionate about contracting for renewable electricity and working with their utilities. But nonetheless, we've seen some pretty holistic improvement across the board. We don't have too much in the way of renewables at this point across Asia and the Middle East, but we are certainly engaging providers across some of those emergent markets and continue to drive higher implementation of renewable electricity contracts. We've always messaged with our site and business leadership that we anticipate global impacts of about 5 to 10% premiums for these renewable electricity instruments. And that has been very well received, especially when we're able to go out and do the energy treasure hunts before we have those renewable electricity conversations. When we do our treasure hunts, we're typically able to find 10 to 15% in low cost or no cost energy savings opportunities. So if we can first promise people some savings and then later on ask for a little bit of extra money, that tends to be much better received than going and just trying to drive renewable electricity from the beginning. And it's also more cost beneficial because we want to really reduce that energy waste before we start to pay that incremental premium for renewable electricity. And that picture in the bottom right is the from a event that we did in Singapore, which was very exciting. It was the first time we had our chief sustainability officer actually join in a treasure hunt. And I think that was very impactful, again, at starting that conversation and moving towards renewable electricity. We've also relied pretty heavily and increasingly on-site renewable electricity generation. So we've got about 14 megawatts of installed capacity around the world and a number of projects that are also under construction or in the planning phase. I do want to point out, though, that we have some very large arrays. At the same time, it's very, very difficult due to the low energy density of this generation source to drive more than 15 or 20% of the site's total electricity consumption from these on-site solar systems. There are a couple exceptions, of course, notable one on this slide being in Brazil, where there may be policies from the local utilities or the government that allow you to sell excess renewable capacity back to the grid and get a good market price for that as well. So there are certain exceptions, and it's also dependent on what's going on within the building. But in the bottom center picture, that is a site we have in Malaysia. That's about a 3 megawatt solar array, and it's been very impressive to see the impact and the cost savings benefit that we've realized from installing these systems. They're never easy to get the projects over the finish line, but we explore lots of different contracting options, ways for Emerson to pay for the capital and ways for developers to pay for the capital. And we've seen a lot of luck in different world areas, again, at really reducing those utility expenses. When we start to look at the third pillar that I mentioned on that strategy slide, our scope 1 abatement, that's where things really do start to get much more complicated for us. On the left side is a general breakdown of our scope 1 emissions. And you can see the bottom part of that, the majority is going to, or the largest proportion is going to stationary fuels. So that's our natural gas, propane, kerosene, etc. All the different types of fuels we use either for process consumption or for comfort heating. We also have a very significant portion of our scope 1 breakdown going to our mobile fleet. And that has just been increasing as our portfolio evolves. I think we were very surprised to see that almost on par with our stationary fuel scope 1 emission breakdown. So of course, when we talk about electric vehicles, that is a critical part of our strategy when we look at scope 1. We're just now starting to understand the scale of our refrigerant footprint. Our estimation and actual tracking of the refrigerant leakage throughout our systems has gotten much better. And as we improve that tracking, the proportion that goes to refrigerants continues to go up. So that's something that we're trying to develop more bespoke strategies on how to support our sites in replacing refrigerant, and especially these high GWP refrigerants. When we look at our scope 1 emissions, the end goal is really to understand which of the projects are priorities for us to pursue and make sure that we're able to fund those. We started about a year ago trying to map our scope 1 emissions. We always had a very high level understanding of where we were using our stationary fuels, but we didn't have the granular detail to be able to say this percent is going to this technology. And over the past year, we've really zeroed in on that. And I can now confidently say that about 2/3 of our stationary fuel consumption is just going to comfort heating alone. So 2/3 of our total stationary fuel emission is just keeping people warm in cold places during winter. And then about 1/3 of that, of course, is going to process emissions, which means that is the stationary fuel use that is going for us to be able to actually make and manufacture our products, which those are much more complicated generally to offset, because if you make a mistake when you're trying to address a comfort heating system, of course, we don't want our employees to be uncomfortable and cold. But if you make a mistake when you're addressing the process emissions, you run the risk of not being able to make products. So I'm sure that's a problem that many folks have seen within their networks as well. The second sort of phase of this is understanding which of the abatement levers are going to be most impactful at addressing which of those stationary fuel levers or the mobile fuel levers as well. So of course, we talked about energy efficiency, but it continues to play a pretty critical role in addressing the scope 1 area as well, where if we can reduce certain amounts of that scope 1 consumption, perhaps we can actually eliminate systems entirely and reduce the electrification load that will ultimately need to come into play. Electric vehicles, as I mentioned, are becoming a very hot button topic for us as our executives continue to take an interest in that rising proportion of mobile fuel emissions. So we're trying to drive much more in the way of making sure we have electric vehicle charging infrastructure at our sites, which is a critical enabler for a lot of this technology because many employees who may be eligible for a company vehicle may not be able to install chargers at home. And if we want to drive these Scope 1 emissions, we need to make sure that infrastructure is available. So over in Europe, we've actually implemented in 2023 a policy where people are now able to get electric vehicles for their company vehicles. And then, as I mentioned, step three, the end result here is to make sure we're able to prioritize projects in a cost-effective way and really prioritize this value creation across our network. We're value creating in many ways, partially because we're reducing our own emissions and supporting certain cost reductions, but we're also helping develop many of the technologies that we also supply equipment to as well. So there's kind of a two-way street in which we like to view and try to pitch some of these projects. I'll also point out that there is a massive amount of incentives available globally. So a huge part of this is understanding that those incentive opportunities. And we've actually brought in a couple of third parties to help us stay on top of this constantly evolving landscape, such that we can prioritize projects where there may be additional funding opportunities, either from governments, from utilities, and see where that can be used to drive greater decarbonization within our Scope 1 emissions specifically. One of the ways that we've gotten a little bit ahead of our facility, or excuse me, one of the ways that we've gotten ahead of our sustainability investments is through the implementation of a sustainable building standards document. We've realized that it is exceptionally difficult to replace equipment and replace systems once they've already been installed. And really the best time to drive net zero conversations is before a facility is even built. I will say this document applies not just to new builds, but also anytime we are doing significant renovations of a facility, really anything over 10,000 square feet, this document becomes applicable. And within this document, we have a lot of different provisions that are highly aligned to that net zero strategy. A lot of this is adapted from LEED and other building standards that are widely accepted. We've just tailored this to be a little bit more specific to the needs of our facility base and of our manufacturing processes. So when it comes to energy efficiency, just like LEED, we anchor everything to ASHRAE 90.1, making sure we're building structures that are more efficient than those baselines as outlined in the standards, which includes the use of things like LEDs and automated lighting controls, those building management systems, and then especially relevant as of recently has been making sure our facilities are prepared for the hybrid and remote working environment. We noticed, especially towards the beginning of the pandemic, that many of our facilities were becoming far larger than we needed. And although, of course, some back to in-person work has happened, we continue to make plans for how to address this new hybrid work era that we live in, which includes temporary seating arrangements and ways that we can shut down the energy consumption in parts of the building when there may not be people there because they're working from home. In terms of renewable energy, I think there was a couple inciting incidents where we had facilities that were brand new that had roofs that were simply not strong enough to support solar arrays. So we want to make sure anytime we are building these new sites that they are at the very least eligible and capable of supporting on-site renewable energy installations. And of course, the resiliency piece is becoming very significant as well. So how can we use renewable energy, specifically wind and solar, to drive resiliency such that if we have power interruptions, we don't need to fully shut down our production environment? And then in terms of Scope 1 abatement, as I mentioned earlier, we're making sure that we have this electric vehicle charging infrastructure in place. And many of the times we will actually install just a couple of EV chargers, but install the infrastructure, the cabling, such that we can increase the number of chargers when our fleet needs require it later on. We also, a huge priority of this document is frankly making sure that our new sites are not dependent on natural gas, because we've seen once these systems are brand new, it doesn't make financial sense to replace them, especially when they're not at the end of their life. So we want to do this right from the first place. Within this document, we've got not only the building performance standards, but we also have a number of case studies from our sustainable building stock and a number of products that we can use that we make to support our end goal here. We've got a couple of projects, or a number of projects, I should say, at this point that are in progress, and a couple that have actually been completed using this sustainable building standards. And we've seen a pretty significant impact just within that small subset of how they're able to drive decarbonization from the beginning, such that they don't have to worry the same extent about how they're going to drive things like their scope 1 reductions. So it's been very impactful, and we're continuing to update this as we learn more from our contracting and design partners and refresh it with things that reflect our updated strategies as well. One of the very impactful things that we were able to implement about a year ago now was our internal carbon value, or internal carbon price process. The easiest way to think about this for us is the internal carbon value is a conversion factor from emissions to dollars. While our end goal is absolutely reducing our emissions, none of our business processes, in fact, are built around the idea of reducing emissions. Everything is built around dollars and cents. But if we can convert one to the other, all of a sudden we can embed the carbon discussion into our investment decisions and really increase the literacy around the topic throughout the finance org, and as well with some of the many project starters who are at our sites as well. So an example of how our carbon valuation works, which might be a little bit different from other sites, is in the bottom left. So if we have two investment options, a gas furnace and an electric furnace in an area that has a low carbon grid, or perhaps we're buying renewables for that electric furnace, typically what we will see is that the electric option is going to be not only more expensive to buy, but it's also going to be more expensive to operate. And the classic ROI, the classic financial analysis would say, go with the cheaper option, and that's how you stay in business. However, we have these long-term goals. We have committed to them publicly, and we take our word to our shareholders very seriously. So we needed to find a way to build that emission reduction into our financial process. And what we do here is we actually boost the return on investment of the lower emitting option instead of handicapping the return on investment of the higher emitting option. Because with many companies, your goal is to get over a certain hurdle rate for that return on investment calculation. And this allows some of those lower emitting options to actually increase their ROI such that they will be accepted internally. We've seen some mixed impact from this program. I think there's certain project types that we've seen it's far more impactful than others. And of course, other areas where the difference in capital cost, the difference in operating cost just means that the carbon price we use is not always high enough. Some of the ways that we were able to actually implement this is frankly because we view that there's a lot of carbon emissions in the world already covered by carbon pricing instruments, about 25%. And that number is only going to continue to increase with some of the global legislation that's out there. For example, in the European Union, they've implemented or are implementing the carbon border adjustment mechanism, which essentially does impose a de facto tax, a carbon tax, on any entity that is going to be importing product into Europe. So this actually becomes a competitive advantage once these emissions are being taxed, and it's something that we wanted to drive readiness for. Of course, there's the benefit on the right side. You could see one of the main things was, of course, to actually drive decarbonization project investments. But a huge selling point of this was, frankly, the readiness for these possible government-imposed carbon taxes and the carbon taxes that we're already seeing, and in some cases, actually potentially paying. This is quite a process to get implemented, and it actually took about 2 years from start to finish, where we needed to drive buy-in across a very wide range of stakeholders, starting from individual contributors all the way up to our C-suite executives and across finance, operations, engineers, and beyond. So It really was important to make sure that we had that understanding of why we were doing this and how the mechanism would work in terms of our financial request process, such that we could go and implement this successfully. Switching gears a little bit now to address scope 3, and I realize I don't have a summary slide for this scope 3, but our scope 3 emissions are about a little under 7 million metric tons, which you can see on this slide is about 33 times greater than our scope 1 and 2 emissions combined. So like many companies, our scope 3 emission footprint dwarfs that of our scope 1 and 2 footprint. And actually, we had some portfolio changes over the past couple of years, as I've mentioned. So our scope 3 number used to be about 600 million metric tons, which is about the same number as all of the emissions of South Korea. Now we're looking at about all of the emissions. Now the ballpark is about all of the emissions of Costa Rica. So much smaller, but we're still talking country level emissions when we look at our scope 3 footprint. So one of the ways that we're addressing this, of course, is to understand what is the impact of the expected decarbonization of the grid, the expected decarbonization of various world areas, and understanding what is the gap between what entities like the International Energy Agency are seeing and what we need to actually go and achieve. So we've done a lot of modeling to understand what those gaps are. And what we do see is that as the IEA continues to continues to refine their projections, the gap does get a little bit smaller. And of course, that depends on which models you're using. Nonetheless, we do know that there will be a significant gap that we need to take actions for. We can't just rely on the natural decarbonization of other people. We need to be proactive and drive our own strategies. So we've done that modeling for an overwhelming majority of our scope 3 footprint, but we continue to refine on what those actions are going to be now that we understand what those gaps are. And a little bit on what some of those strategies are for those scope 3 footprint. We like to think about this in terms of the upstream, the core scope 3 emissions, and then our downstream actions as well. So in terms of our upstream, which is how everything that happens before product arrives at Emerson, we've really driven a responsible sourcing program from the ground up over the past 2 years. We started really in 2021 with global, we called them Greening Together summits, where we go to different world areas, bring a group of our critical suppliers together and try to discuss our decarbonization strategies, try to understand what actions they're taking and how we can collaborate together to reduce not only their scope 1 and 2 emissions, but together our scope 3 emissions. We've implemented as well a new responsible sourcing policy to not only guide how our suppliers should be behaving and performing, but how our internal supply chain managers and commodity managers can support those suppliers. Our goal is never to tell our suppliers at this point that you have to do something without providing guidance. We want to be working together. We are partners in this, and we understand that we can't achieve decarbonization, nor can we make our products on our own. So we need to be working on this collaboratively. This past year, we did our first emission data collection of our suppliers. We were a little resistant at first. Some of our execs were a little resistant at first to go and bug our suppliers for the incredibly detailed level of information we would need to actually make some of these calculations. But now that we've reached a higher level of maturity, now that we can provide much more guidance in terms of what we expect and what we need our suppliers to be doing, we're more comfortable having these conversations and supporting the quantification of their emission inventories as well. I think one big win over the past year was the introduction of our supplier sustainability awards, where we're actually now recognizing some of our suppliers for their excellent achievements in the world of decarbonization. And that's been really impactful, not only at highlighting some of the best practices that can be shared across our other supplier network, but it's been very exciting to engage directly with those suppliers who've been exceptionally passionate at driving emission reductions. And then one of the tangible actions we took on upstream was actually just moving around and mode shifting some of our logistics. So understanding that many of our products were being shipped by plane that probably didn't need to be. They didn't need to get to their end destination as quickly as possible. So understanding if we can shift those to lower emitting ocean freight, if we can ship those by rail or by truck instead of the very carbon intense air freight that we were previously using to get things around the world quickly. In terms of some of the core areas that we've been working on, we've been very actively engaging our new product development and design engineering teams to first conduct life cycle assessments to understand what are the hotspots in our products life cycles that are actually driving emissions. So we know that in some cases, the majority of the emissions are happening at our customer sites in the use phase, but with other products, the majority of the emissions associated are actually in the manufacturing phase. And so there's very different strategies we need to apply in the design engineering and product development phase such that we can drive each of those different types of products to be lower emitting overall. And then finally, for downstream, a lot of this is a little bit tricky because it's very difficult to tell your customers exactly how to use your products. So some of this is direct customer engagement to understand and share what we're doing on our scope 1 and 2 emissions, supporting them in their renewable electricity procurement, and of course, talking up all of the benefits that you can get from working with Energy Star to essentially drive those scope 1 and 2 emission reductions. And then even more broadly, we are working not only with organizations like the Clean Energy Buyers Association and RE100, but a number of other industry trade groups to understand where are these technologies going and what sort of advocacy can we do to support lower emitting products moving forward. Internally, we've done a lot of education. I think that's a huge piece of this. Again, we have a pretty large organization. So making sure that our employees understand what is in our supplier code of conduct, what do they need to be sharing with suppliers and customers in terms of our sustainability targets, and how we can influence either directly or indirectly to ultimately drive towards the point that us, our suppliers, and many of our customers are all trying to get to together. And then this is not maybe directly related to our decarbonization project strategy, but I thought it was very important to include nonetheless, and it is indirectly included in our scope 3 emissions because category 5 is related to waste from operations. So we have a new zero waste to landfill target. It has a slightly different time horizon than our emission reduction because we were a little bit behind the emission process in terms of setting this target. But we have committed to diverting 90% of our waste from landfill at all of our manufacturing sites around the world. And frankly, this is a pretty big challenge for us. Not that we produce a huge volume of waste, but we do produce a pretty diverse array of waste streams that are, in many cases, in different world areas, can be very difficult to address. So our overall diversion rate in 2023 was about 56%, which of course leaves a pretty big gap for us to get to that 90%. The majority of that diversion was done through recycling, although of course we had a little bit of benefit from reuse, remarketing, and composting as well. We do not consider incineration in any form, with or without energy recovery, to be diversion from landfill. We want to be addressing these waste streams at their source and really eliminating them instead of just going with a different disposal option. Some of the strategies here, as I said, we're a little bit less mature in this area. So primarily, we're still focused on improving our data collection, improving the guidance that we give to teams in terms of how we should be quantifying and tracking waste and its diversion. And ultimately, we've seen some pretty big improvements alone just from looking at the data where we see outliers, digging into that and trying to understand what drives this very low or very high diversion rate. In some cases, we found errors that were causing those numbers. And in many cases, we did find that, of course, there's some sites that just don't have good waste management practices with non-hazardous waste. Of course, none of this applies to hazardous waste, which we've always disposed of according to local regulations. We're also starting to work with some of our suppliers and even our customers to understand how we can divert and eliminate that incoming packaging waste. Many of the times our suppliers were sending us product in single-use packaging. So understanding if there's options to either send them back that packaging such that they can reuse it, or to switch to more sustainable packaging alternatives that either we can reuse or eventually recycle. So this has been much more of a recent journey for us, but we've driven, I think, some pretty credible progress that we're hoping to be able to report moving forward at the end of, well, our fiscal year has closed, but once we have all of the data from our most recent fiscal year. And then finally, I just want to touch on the culture aspect, because I think this is really underpinning a lot of our success across all of the areas of sustainability, whether that's environment, social, or even the governance elements. We are a 74,000 person organization, and to get a message out to drive alignment across that organization takes an incredible amount of education and celebrating our culture when it has been very impactful. So we've put a lot of time investing into our workforce through many informal and formal training topics. We've created we call it our Sustainability Aficionados program, which was until last week was led by a very capable PhD from the University of Cambridge, who had driven some incredible programming, both in terms of webinars, blog posts, and other short, approachable content that makes people not scared of environmental sustainability. I think many of the times people are a little bit afraid to take those first steps. And once they understand the local impact, the personal impact that they can have, it becomes much less intimidating as a process. We also created a formal environmental sustainability training that is hosted on the same portal that we host things like our ethics training and product compliance trainings. So we've seen over 8,000 employees trained on this in 2023 alone, far greater than even the year before that. Across our global facility network, we've got over 120 green teams that have been established. And we actually have a green team council where we get together quarterly, we share best practices, we highlight incredible things that our green teams have done. And I think especially impactfully, we have over the past 3 years done something called the Earth Month Eco Challenge. So I would eco challenge all of you during April of this year to take a peek and try to get behind this. It's been incredibly impactful at driving and capturing some of the enthusiasm around the topic. And it makes it very approachable because there's very specific actions that you're directed to take where you can actually earn points. And there's a whole leaderboard that we celebrate and actually recognize the people who perform the best. So this is something you can find it on ecochallenge.org. And I would definitely recommend it as a very impactful way to motivate your passionate employees to have that local and really global impact as well. And then finally, I think in 2021, we introduced our first environmental sustainability awards. And over the past 3 years, the number of submissions that we've gotten has just increased exponentially, where we maybe got a few submissions the first year, maybe 10 to 15 the second year. And in 2023, we received 74 submissions from our sites. So the burden of work to sort through all of these outstanding submissions has certainly gone up. At the same time, we have seen some truly incredible projects that our facilities and our teams have driven around the world. And one of the other areas that has really driven a lot of enthusiasm and exciting content is through our sustainability report photo contest, where we capture or solicit photos from all of our employees around the world. And there's actually a whole voting process where we can choose the most amazing photographs that people submit. And those actually do appear in our environment or in our sustainability report. So I think on the next slide, I'm hoping I've got one of those pictures as well. But the last thing that we did was we call it our 9 Sustainable Choices campaign. And the point of this was to, again, drive employees to personally contribute both to our goals and to be a little bit more sustainable in how they live their lives. So whether that's number 7, which is mind your travel, encouraging employees to, on certain occasions, take sustainable transportation to work or to take business trips in a more sustainable way if possible, or whether that's going to be number 6, greening your diet, and at least educating employees so that they can be empowered to have lower carbon diets wherever possible. This is, of course, not mandatory, but we really want to tap into that enthusiasm wherever it exists and at least educate people who may not know the options that they have available to them. So I think that concludes the slides I've got and the general environmental sustainability overview. At this point, I would be very happy to take any questions.